When I was 14 years old, I was spending a Saturday night relaxing, and all I was planning on doing was watching Netflix alone in my family's cozy vacation cabin. It was a small 2-bedroom cabin out in the country, which meant that there were no houses for miles, but I liked the quiet. My parents were out on a date and were probably not going to get home until midnight or so because of all the roads were backed up due to a snowstorm. It was getting late, and I was waiting on the pizza I had ordered like an hour ago, and was starting to wonder what was taking so long. Domino's was too far away from me to do a delivery, but a buddy of mine was a manager there, and it was usually pretty cool about letting it slide, so I just figured that it was taking a while because it was a pretty good drive and the roads were icy. I sat on the sofa and decided that I was going to watch a horror movie on Netflix alone. After getting a bowl of popcorn, I sat down and hit play. When I was about 5 minutes into the movie, I jumped to the sudden sound of the doorbell. Realizing that it was the pizza guy, I sped to the front door. I opened the door and was startled by what I saw. It was a dirty, middle-aged man. So dirty that he looked like a homeless guy living on the streets. He had long, greasy hair and he needed to shave. The only thing that kept me from slamming the door was the fact that he was holding a pizza box and was wearing a Domino's uniform, which honestly looked as if he threw it on as fast as possible. Buttons weren't aligned and it looked as if it was a few sizes too small. The name tag on the shirt saying Michael Smith looked as if he was hanging by a thread. He was staring at me, directly into my eyes and smiling at me, not even blinking once. His smile gave me an uneasy feeling. It was so big, almost unnatural. He said, "Hi, I'm Ted. Did you order a large cheese pizza?" I said yes, and he was still giving me that cold smile. I reached into my pocket looking for the cash I had. Feeling nothing, I said, "I'll be right back. My parents left the money in the kitchen." He quickly responded, "Oh, so your parents aren't here?" I wouldn't say that. This caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting a response like that, or even a response at all. I was starting to get bad feelings about the guy, so before I left to go into the kitchen, I pushed the door almost shut, leaving a slight crack open, and put the chain lock on, just in case. I rushed into the kitchen because I still didn't feel comfortable with that man. I grabbed my wallet and started shuffling through my bills to find the 20 I had in there. My concentration was disrupted by the sounds of a breaking news alert on the TV that we always had on the news channel in the kitchen. The bold letters on the bottom of the screen read, "Domino's pizza delivery man named Michael Smith found stabbed to death in a ditch unclothed." I froze in shock. I remembered that man standing on my front doorstep had the name tag reading Michael Smith, and that he said his name was Ted. Chills shot down my spine. As I put two and two together, I turned around, basically running at the door. I screamed when the front door was wide open and the pizza box was lying on the floor, right next to the stairs. I examined the door, seeing that the chain lock had been busted right off. I reached for my phone that I always kept in my back pocket and nearly cried when I felt nothing and remembered that I had left it charging on my nightstand in my room upstairs. I started going through all the options I had. I couldn't just run out into the snowstorm and run a mile to the nearest house. I couldn't hide until my parents got home. That would be a few hours from now. The only option I had was to get that phone upstairs and call 911. I felt like my heart was going to stop. I grabbed the biggest knife I could find. Not that I was going to be brave enough to use it anyway. My knees and hands were shaking as I slowly walked up the stairs, trying not to make a sound. I got to the last step and saw my room. The door was wide open. I started to mentally prepare myself for what might happen as soon as I walk into that room. I tiptoed to the side of the door, making sure that it wasn't visible to whoever was inside. I peered my head into the room. No creepy killer standing in the middle of the room with an axe. In fact, the room was just as I left it. I could see my phone on my nightstand, which was across my bed on the farthest side of the room, right next to the closet. I walked in there and reached across my bed. I was a few inches from grabbing my phone and calling the police. I inched forward and grabbed it. I took a deep breath in relief. Hearing the 911 operator's voice gave me a sense of safety. The woman on the other end of the line said, "911, what is your emergency?" "Hi, yes, my name is Matthew and there is a man somewhere in my house. I'm in a cabin on Shirley Avenue." I said this fairly quickly. I'd seen so many episodes of Law and Order that I'd already know what information that the operator needed. As the operator was telling me to stay on the line, something caught my eye. My closet. I always kept my closet closed because I was always paranoid about seeing things in the dark. In my closet, not being able to see what was in there. Of course, there was nothing ever actually in there until now. The closet door was slightly open just enough to see two eyes staring at me. Those eyes were not the worst part. What keeps me up at night to this day was the fact that he was still smiling. So big, I screamed and the closet door swung forcefully open. Now I could see his whole body, his face still smiling at me. I never ran so fast in my life. I booked it out the room, through the hallway, and the footsteps behind me were never further than a few feet away from me. I managed to turn my head to see the man behind me still chasing me, still smiling. I threw myself into the bathroom at the far end of the hallway and locked it. He began to laugh, but this laugh wasn't like a deep, raspy voice, which is how I imagine it to sound like. It was so high-pitched, it sounded so childish, which made the whole situation even more nerve-wracking. He was now throwing his body against the door. Every time I heard the sound of the man's body being thrown at the door, the man's childish laugh still followed. I knew I didn't have much time until that small chintzy door eventually broke down, but I also knew that I wasn't going to be that much longer until the police arrived. I quickly looked around the bathroom, unfamiliar with it since I usually used the downstairs one. My body was already halfway out the second I saw the small bathroom window, which I noticed before until now. Somehow, after a couple more seconds of squirming and around, I fell to the ground and was outside. I immediately felt an unbearable pain in my ankle, struggling to stand up and trying to make a run for it. I realised that I was a dead man, as I could only get a few hops away from the cabin with the storm as strong as it was an hour ago. An hour ago, when I wasn't fending for my life, when I was watching that Netflix movie, not having a care in the world about anything, and now it was all going to come to an end. I sat down thinking about my 14 years of life, thinking about the last thing I said to my parents, my friends, thinking about the things that I haven't done yet. I could still hear the man banging against that door, followed by his laugh. I couldn't hear the wooden door start to crack. Just a couple more tries and he was in. He immediately noticed the open window and knew I was outside. I knew it wouldn't take long for him to run out the front door and get to where I was helplessly sitting. I looked back and forth to each side of the house, not knowing which side he was coming from. Then I saw him, peering his head over the side of the house, only making his smiling face visible. I screamed in fear as the man, still wearing that Domino's uniform, was tiptoeing to me. He was tiptoeing to me like you would see in a cartoon, making his steps really dramatic. This frightened me as I began to realise how insane this man really was. He was about 5 feet away from me when I heard the beautiful sound of police sirens. There could not have been a better time for the police to show up, because as soon as that man heard the sirens, he gave one last look at me, smiled, waved, and as he ran off into the woods over the loud sound of the wind, I swear I could hear that man laughing. When the cops eventually pulled into my driveway, I crawled towards them, inch by inch, waving my arms in the air, catching their attention. Tears rushed down my face out of disbelief of what had happened. They called an ambulance and wrapped my ankle up. They tried to send me away to hospital because my ankle was indeed broken, but I wasn't leaving until I knew that cabin was searched head to toe. I tried to tell them the story, but was only able to get a few sentences out that barely made sense. After they calmed me down, they were able to get the full story out of me. I stayed with the two officers and made sure they checked the cabin while the other two officers searched the woods nearby. By this time, it was basically pitch black and my parents finally arrived. After a long search, there was no sign of that man. I got absolutely no sleep for the next few nights, still imagining that big, creepy smile. After this whole situation, I wish I could say that I hear the occasional knocks at the door or something cliche, but no, it has been quiet with no sign of that man again. I hope to never see that grinning face for as long as I live, whether that man's intentions were to kill me, or much, much worse. On my first summer back home from my freshman year of college, I picked up a part-time job delivering pizza in a town around 30 minutes away from where I lived. The area in rural Georgia is known for having places that are practically in the middle of nowhere, and the pizza place's whole shtick was that it delivered to even the most remote areas imaginable within the town limits. I could fill the books with weird experiences that summer, from the call that came from a long abandoned warehouse to the dog that got so excited about the pizza in my hand and accidentally shredded my pants with her claws. But one will always stand out in my mind as the creepiest. It was getting fairly late, around 10:30 p.m, so I was confident that at that time I would be sent on no further calls before closing at 11. However, someone barely managed to miss the cut-off time, and our clerk accepted their order since they were so close. I was given the address and a single box of hot dough and sent on my merry little way. The first red flag was the driveway, or rather, the lack thereof. There was a mailbox but no actual driveway, not even gravel, it was just grass, and a barely distinguishable trodden pathway that resembled more of a service trail than it did something frequently used. I bumped along wondering if I was even en route to the place, when I saw a slightly above average sized house come over the horizon, horribly dilapidated and completely surrounded by overgrown woods. I guesstimated where the rest of the driveway led, and ended up parking in a grassy patch that could have been the walkway just as easily as it could have been the front yard, headlights aimed towards the porch as per company policy. I walked up to the door, but I believe that calling it a door is generous. It was a door frame, alright, but the door itself was just a large slab of wood propped up haphazardly against the side of the house, barely covering the entrance. This was red flag number 2. The third and fourth red flag were also the door. This included an A4 sheet of printer paper with the words "around back" scribbled in all caps, which was hanging just below the place where somebody had engraved the door with the title Manson Family Ranch. Typically, I would never go around to the back of a house, especially a shady, unlit house, and especially at night. However, it was my last drop of the day and I was ready to get it over with and be on my way home. Against my better judgment, I traipsed around the back of the house. The door here was an actual door, but it was covered in both cobwebs and fresh spider webs. Clearly this was a door that had not been used in some time. I found the cleanest area available and knocked. I counted to 45 and knocked again. There was no lights in the house and I could hear no movement inside. I knocked and counted again and repeated the sequence 3 more times before I was finally creeped enough to decide to return to my car. As I turned, I heard a voice coming from inside the house, clearly agitated, but I couldn't tell what they were saying. I tried to knock 1 more time, and as I was counting, I heard something in the woods behind me. It started out as just movement deep in the trees, but soon enough I could make out distinct running footsteps coming directly towards me through the bush. As I'm standing there, coming to terms with my impending demise, I followed the direction of the noise toward the edge of the wood, which is around 15 feet away from me. In the moonlight I could clearly see the woman who stepped out. She was relatively old, maybe in her 60s, I would guess. She had long blonde grey hair which was tangled, matted and hung down past her hips. She was in what looked to be originally a white nightgown, but at the time it was dingy and closer to a beigeish brown colour. She was absolutely barefoot and her feet were covered in dirt and what had to be blood, presumably due to the fact that she had just sprinted through the prickly woods where there was no trail to be seen. I never learned her name, but I affectionately refer to her as red flag number 5. She stopped short when she saw me and started to shake her head no, eyes wide. I stood there like a terrified deer in the most fucked up headlights ever as she took one more step towards me, reaching out to me, finger pointed. Her voice came out way stronger than mine would have at a time when she spoke. You know how southern people can either sound like loving grandmothers or backwards murderers? Well, she sounded like the latter when she drawled, "Oh, no, honey, no, you get on, get on out of here." I wish I could say I listened, ran and left, but I was in such shock at how events were playing out that my own self-preservation was put on a back burner while I tried to figure out just what in the Kentucky Fried Fuck was happening. She seemed to realise that I was not moving, even if I could not make my mouth move to ask her what was happening or even what to do with the stupid pizza in my hands. She looked at me like she could have smacked the hair out of me right there and then, and proceeded to deliver red flags 6 through 12. "Darling, did you hear me? You deaf or dumb? Young girls like you come out here and then they don't get to leave." So I finally quit being the white person in the horror movie when I realised that this was not a funny little ghost story. This was 5'3", 116-pound me, potentially being targeted to be robbed, kidnapped or much worse. So I dropped the dumb little pizza, which had serious serial killer toppings by the way, and started running back to my car, which I'd stupidly left on and unlocked, as was usual for most of my deliveries. As I neared the car, I heard a slam from behind me, and looked over my shoulder to see that the wooden door had been pushed over and fallen into the porch beneath it. As I was closing the car door, an older man was limping down the front steps, waving his arms like an airplane runway attendant at me, calling me a little bitch, telling me to get out the fucking car now. At a loss for what to do, I called out something muttery along the lines of, "Pizza's out back." I floored my dad's shitty little Lexus and somehow managed to avoid the trees on the old trail back to the main road, which was still 12 miles and several turns from any world that could actually had a name, let alone painted lights. I reported it to my manager and he said he contacted the police, but nothing ever came of it as I'm aware. Either way, that was my first and hopefully last personal encounter with the self-proclaimed Manson Family Ranch. For a while I had a job at a pizza parlour in the countryside near the Scottish-English border in the United Kingdom. I wasn't the usual delivery man, but sometimes, if the usual delivery man had a day off, I'd be given the job. It was a very foggy evening in November when it happened. I was doing some janitorial work when my boss called me and told me that the delivery man had left work early and that I was to finish his work for him. I was actually kind of glad because I always enjoy delivering pizzas because of how you get to explore a little while you're out. I walked outside and put the pizza into my car, which was a 91 Honda Civic, and entered the given address into my phone's GPS. I looked at the map to see that the address was in England and was far from any towns marked on the map. I shrugged it off, assuming that it would be simply a small town not marked on any maps like the one I lived in. The drive was quite painful. It was already evening and the fog made it difficult to see. The evening was also extremely quiet. I probably only passed maybe a few cars on the motorway. When the GPS told me to exit the motorway, I did so to find that the directions were leading me into thickly forested areas. Eventually the one-lane road I was driving on switched from poorly maintained tarmac to dirt. There were no signs of civilization anywhere in these woods, just darkness, fog and trees. When the GPS said I finally arrived, I looked up to see an old, abandoned-looking house that was nearly hidden by all the thick fog. It was a one-story house that was covered in wear and tear, as if no one had lived in there for decades. Even through all the fog, I could see that many of the windows were broken. Some didn't seem to have any glass in them at all. I didn't like the look of this place at all, but I knew that the last person who brought back a pizza got fired on the spot. I was a poor guy, and I wasn't about to lose my job over a pizza. I tried to ignore all the damage and overgrowth and began to get ready to open the door to my car, but as I reached for the door handle, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. There was a person, probably twice as high as anyone else, leaning against the side of my car, looking down at me. I immediately floored it and drove ahead. After about 10 seconds, the dirt road came to an end, and I barely had time to hit the brakes and avoid crashing into a tree at the end of the road. Thoughts were racing through my head. If I wanted out of there, I had to drive back and go past that house. What did that man want? Could he still see me? I decided to turn and drive past the house as quickly as possible. I did a 3-point turn at the dead end and began to drive back in the direction of the old house. As I neared the house, my headlights revealed a sight that still frightens me to this day. There were at least 5 large men, each as tall as the first one, sprinting at my car. I stepped on it and narrowly missed me as I drove off. I truly wished that the story ended there, but somehow it didn't. After that incident, I almost quit my job, but ended up staying after my boss told me that I didn't have to do any more delivering again. I was relieved but horrified when I heard that the normal delivery man was assigned to that very house I encountered. Sadly, he didn't get so lucky, and his body was later found by police. The men who tried to attack me were never found.